Okay, so Warhammer 3's worldwide gameplay reveal is happening next week on May 13th, and we've already gotten a teaser for what we can expect. The Ice Queen Tzarina Katarin and the armies of Kislev marching on the blood-red kingdom of Khorne, which sounds like madness on paper. To rally an army of mortals to your side and take the fight to the ruinous powers on their home turf sounds like a one-way ticket, a desperate last gambit, a suicide mission to buy time for something or someone else. What that something or someone is or will be, nobody but Creative Assembly knows at this point, not even the people who played the battle, but it's a safe assumption it will play a central role in the narrative of Warhammer 3's Vortex campaign equivalent. So, after seeing Winged Lancers, a giant Frostbear, and Kievan Shield Walls plunge into Khorne's domain to do battle with Bloodletters, Bloodthirsters, and Mortal Berserkers, I figured it might be a good time to follow up on my previous Realms of Chaos lore video and discuss the practicality and the impossibility of assaulting the kingdoms of the Dark Gods on their home turf in the Warp. How realistic or how lore-friendly is the idea of taking an army of mortals and plunging into hell itself? Well, in the rules set out by the Warhammer Fantasy Universe, most incursions would probably look something like this for the attackers. Only pain and misery would await you on the other side. But why? Why are demons, who are already a massive threat to the forces of order on the material plane, an even larger problem when they're fighting for their traditional stomping grounds, under the gaze of their wrathful gods? Well, first, you have to remember that the Realms of Chaos are impossibly massive kingdoms, forged from the coalesced emotions and actions of mortal beings, and are, generally speaking, completely incongruent with mortal life. The hordes that inhabit these realms are, for all intents and purposes, infinite. I mean, the only reason they haven't overrun the surface world yet is because they require an insane amount of magic to manifest on the mortal plane in large numbers. Magic that hasn't really existed in sufficient quantities for many thousands of years because of the Great Vortex and its vacuum cleaner tendencies. And of course, the bigger the demon, or the army for that matter, the harder it is for these demonic entities to stay in corporeal form. The more magic is required to sustain their essence. So the closest they ever came to overrunning the surface world was during the Great Catastrophe, during the reign of Lord Croak and Anarion the Defender many thousands of years ago, where they numbered in the untold millions and were pouring forth in the Renton reality in never-ending waves of violence and madness. A true cataclysm that would not have been averted but for the sacrifices of the Warhammer world's greatest champions. And even in the end times, their demonic numbers weren't quite on the level of what the world saw back in those days. Of course, by the end times, when that rolled around, Chaos had the benefit of a united Skaven race attacking from below, and a bunch of high-on-pot noose riders that were eager to end the setting, so it wasn't really fair for the forces of order, but then again, fighting demons isn't really fair in the first place. And as we know, each Chaos God, and the realms in which they live, feed off specific traits and behaviors of humanity, elves, and other races. And as they feed and drink off this worship and adulation, fear and pleasure, disease and thirst for knowledge, they grow more and more powerful. These realms are technically on a separate plane of existence, but because of the stellar warp gate collapse at the poles of the planet thousands of years ago, an event that heralded the initial coming of chaos, the immaterium bleeds into the material plane, resulting in the utter insanity we see in the Chaos Waste and beyond, at the edge of the known world. So the first question we have to ask is it even possible for a Kislevite or Imperial or Azure army to cross that threshold, to get an army through the warp gates and appear in the Realms of Chaos, to rematerialize in this separate dimension with your men and your minds still intact? Yes, the answer is yes. Mortals appear in the Realms of Chaos all the time. We get many great looks at that and their perspective of the event in the Liber Chaotica and Malefic. But generally, when these mortals show up, they become playthings, hunted and haunted for sport. So you can get there if you make it through Norska and the Chaos Wastes and forge ahead, but what happens when you finally show up? What would happen if the Ice Queen and 150,000 brave warriors of Ursun kicked the door down and called out the Chaos Gods? Well, for you Lord of the Rings fans, I would liken it to Aragorn and the survivors of the Siege of Minas Tirith and the Pelennor Fields marching on the Black Gate of Mordor, through the plains of Dagorlad, across the plateau of Gorgoroth, up the slopes of Mount Doom, while never-ending hordes of Balrogs and Fell Beasts and Orcs and Easterlings and Mumakil slammed into their ranks. Just an infinite tide of monsters and crushing mass, battering your shield walls and killing your people every single step of the way. As Boromir said, not with 100,000 men could you do this. Demonic armies are literally feeding off your emotions, which are amplified even further so far from home. If you think you'd be scared on the ramparts of Altdorf, watching as 100,000 screaming bloodletters wail at you from below, imagine what that terror would feel like in the shadow of Khorne's Brass Keep, surrounded, isolated, and cut off from everything and everyone you take for granted. As blood rains down from above, as lightning crackles and volcanoes explode and skyscraper-sized titans move through the mist, just barely out of sight, as earth-splitting roars and maniacal laughter batter your eardrums, only the stoutest hearts and the clearest minds would be able to continue. And battle hasn't even started yet. All that fear, all that anger and rage at your impending doom, taken to new heights by a god who is quite literally manipulating your emotions and using that to nourish his own infinite ranks. Well, you can start to see the problems there. And there are some massive logistical concerns with keeping an army fed, supplied, and reinforced when fighting in a separate dimension. How do you bring up new regiments? How do you levy more of the population for the coming conflict? How do you replace the attrition you inevitably suffered in the long march to the Chaos Wastes in Norska? Kind of hard to bring the baggage trains into the Garden of Nurgle, or navigate Tzeentch's Labyrinth of Eternity with a bunch of donkeys and wooden carts. It doesn't really work. With all that said, though, it is important to remember that demons are not some unstoppable, unkillable force of nature. They can still be banished. In fact, they can be put down permanently. Just like in 40k, calling out the true name of a demon can weaken it, and with a sufficiently powerful magical burst or weapon, even Great Unclean Ones or Lords of Change can be obliterated from existence. And this is perhaps one of the strongest points in favor of undergoing this suicidal crusade, that killing a demon in the realm of chaos, provided it's with, as I said, a weapon or channeling of sufficient power, means their soul will have nowhere to return to. If Luin Leonkur kills Kugath Plaguefather at the Siege of Altdorf, the Great Unclean One's soul is just banished to the warp, and he'll be forced to stay there for a while until he regains his strength. But if Luin does the same in the Garden of Nurgle, there's a very real chance that Kugath is gone forever, or at the very least, long enough that the forces of Order would never have to deal with him again. Think a hiatus of some 10,000 years. So for any single faction of Order, assaulting the realms of chaos is suicidal. It's a desperate last hope. But an alliance of all their greatest champions, an all-star team combining people like Tyrion, Teclis, Tzarina Katarin, Karl Franz, Malekith, Hrothgar, Mazdamundi, Vlad von Karstein, Neferata, Thorgrim, and others, all the forces of order, death, destruction together, if they were somehow able to set aside their differences, combine their armies, and assault the realms together, there's no telling what they could accomplish. In that scenario, I think we're starting to see a force that might have a chance. Not to destroy the realms of chaos forever, of course, or even to strike down a god, but to permanently destroy many of their champions, idols, monuments, and favorite places, to strike a crippling blow, and truly weaken their grip on the material world. Obviously, that's a huge caveat. A lot would have to go right to even have a hope, to even get such an alliance formed in the first place. And even in the end times, we didn't have all those forces link up together and forge ahead in a cohesive, well-coordinated counterattack against chaos. That was with the threat of Armageddon looming, and they still weren't able to do it. But if it had happened, Warhammer Fantasy would certainly have a chance to still be around, at least narratively speaking. It's also interesting to note that a small, stealthy force or individual could potentially do more damage than a large army ever could. Again, returning to the Frodo and Sam go to Mordor example, Oxyotl, the legendary chameleon who hunts unseen, killed countless demons during his time in the Realms of Chaos and was never discovered, and he's just one tiny little skinky boy. I don't believe it's ever been truly applied, but a guerrilla war based on subterfuge and sabotage and powerful magic could make an impact in the warp in a manner that straight force of arms never would. Now, another question we have to ask ourselves in this Katarin and Kislev scenario is which realm they would stumble upon, because that would go a long way in dictating how you approach combat and how far you might make it. Each Chaos God has a very different approach to warfare, and very different emotions and feelings on any given day. Emotions that power them, that drive them and their followers. Nurgle, for instance, might find an invasion hilarious and just watch and study it, preferring to spectate the slow attrition and decay of our heroes as they traipse through fecund swamps and pox-filled forests, gnawing away at the army. In a different scenario, an assault in the heart of Khorne's territory, like what's been shown in the teaser so far, would probably result in a demonic horde materializing on your ass in mere moments, and as the promise of blood and skulls immediately drives his followers into a frenzy, with all his champions relishing the opportunity to slaughter entire armies for desecrating a place like the Brass Citadel, the conflict would not stop until every single invader was dead. Not to mention that simply being in the presence of a creature like a Bloodthirster, a greater demon of the Blood God, mortals are often overwhelmed by bloodlust, imbued with a portion of the infinite rage of the God of War, a force that pits friend against friend, foe against foe, abandoning all hope and reason to hack and slash with no thought of defense or safety, as entire battlefields devolve into whirlwinds of death and destruction. The resolution there, in Khorne's realm, would likely be very quick, which begs the question, why is it even going to be a quest battle? It sounds like an entirely unwinnable scenario, and the answer is, because it's cool, because it's a unique and exciting way to show off the kingdoms of each god while getting special, flavorful battle maps and vibes we would not get otherwise. Rule of cool sometimes trumps lore accuracy, even in the novels themselves, in Black Library work, and I imagine, as I said, there will be some narrative explanations in the campaign that attempt to explain why an army of Kislev troops are able to show up and hold their own in literal hell. In fact, it will likely be a driving force behind the entire story, central to the arcs of each legendary lord, faction, and their quest for ascendancy. But I'm very curious what you guys think of the idea. Is it maybe a little bit over the top for you, or is it quintessential Warhammer fantasy and you love it? Is it too unrealistic a scenario, or are you kind of digging the vibes here? Either way, the promise of war is not solely a Khornate theme, obviously, and if an army of 100,000 Gospodar and Ungol Kislevites plunged into any of the Ruinous Pantheon's homes, you can rest assured their lesser and greater demons would not take kindly to that betrayal, to that fact, and would relish the opportunity to punish the invaders. The homes of the other Chaos Gods would grant a very different picture, of course, but one still punctuated by violence. For example, Tzeentch's Crystal Labyrinths would drive attackers insane, the impossibility of his lands driving large chunks of the army mad as they're completely unable to navigate where they're going, long before any Screamers or Flamers drew near to attack, and arcane bolts and fire would devastate an army without sufficient magical protection. You would need someone like Ice Queen Tzarina Katarin to protect you, because otherwise your army is just going to be engulfed in flame. While in the Kingdom of Slaanesh, for instance, they would lure attackers to their doom, granting visions of pleasure and torture in equal measure. Demonettes would frolic at the outskirts of the army, cackling maniacally and promising fame and fortune, while a narcotic musk would infuse the air, making our heroes sleepy, lazy, lackadaisical, lulling them into this false sense of security, and then the crab claws would descend. So, is it realistic to see Ice Queen Tzarina Katarin and a Kislevite army attacking the realm of Khorne by themselves? No, of course not. In the lore, they'd be gobbled up almost immediately. But it is a fantastic way to see new battlefields and ultimately get more content in a cataclysmic setting. So I'm incredibly curious to see how Creative Assembly decides to handle it. There will be some exposition in the narrative that attempts to explain why such an invasion is even possible, even if that reasoning might be a bit spurious. Be it that Khorne's armies are mostly elsewhere, busy invading Ulthuan or the rest of the mortal realm, that the Braves are away from home, and there's an opportunity to strike into the heart of the realm of chaos while they're doing their full-on invasion, kind of like what the Vermintide heroes do at the end of V2. The rule of cool is probably going to prevail here, and I'm curious what you guys think of that decision, or the likelihood of such an attack ever happening in the first place. Let me know in the comment section below, and very soon I will see you all with the very first unveiling of Total War Warhammer 3 gameplay. Hope to see you there. I cannot wait.